All right, we have Abhimanyu here. He's going to be talking about Ember-Data and maybe a little bit of introduction to Ember itself, and that would be great. So, over to you. Thank you again.
Thank you. So, hi, my name is Abhimanyu. I am currently working with Equal Experts. So, let me begin with a general consensus. How many of you have used JavaScript MVC frameworks? Now JavaScript MVC frameworks. All right, cool. So, how many of you have used MVC frameworks in general? Good. So, conceptually, the core concepts for using any kind of a JavaScript MVC is very, very similar to an actual MVC, right? You have the concept of modules, you have views, you have controllers, and all of that stuff, right? But when you look at an HTML JavaScript application, what do you think becomes the view or the controller? So, view obviously is the HTML, right? And the controller and the module are both which are there in your code, right? In the JavaScript code. So, interesting topic, why the road to Ember-Data. So, Ember-Data is a persistence layer for Ember. What is that? We'll get to that in a while. Ember-Data is yet to reach the 1.0 state. It is still in a beta 9, right? But I feel at this particular point of time, we as JavaScript developers are at a state where knowing about something like Ember-Data can really help us build ambitious web applications. That is what Ember says that they allow us to do. So let us quickly have a look at the agenda. So the agenda for today is very simple. We are going to try and build an application which is like IMDb, right? So you will have a list of movies and actors, etc., etc., etc. And we are actually going to see how we would ideally do that using jQuery alone. Then we'll try and see how we would do that if we were just using Ember. And eventually we'll see using Ember-Data, right? So that is the journey that I want us all to go through, right? So let me just show you the application once. So this is the application. You can see I have a list of movies which are coming soon. I have a list of trending movies, and I have some top movies which are here, which have a star rating or something of that sort, right? So if I go ahead and click on a particular movie, I can really see the directors, the cast for that particular movie, the actor, there's the director. I might want to add it to a watch list. I have an edit functionality in line, etc., etc. Right? And this all is data from a server. It's not data which is kept at my JavaScript location or anything of that sort. I'm actually fetching data from a node server, right? So this is the end goal that we are trying to build, right? So starting with, say, jQuery. So creating a simple client-server application using jQuery, what would be the steps that you would take? How would you go about it?
Expose REST endpoints.
True.
So fetch the data.
True.
And then on the client side, you take away to
yes.
render them.
So you will have a lot of AJAX calls, and you will probably have a model layer, something like a translator, which will basically translate all your service response to the model that you have kept at your jQuery side. Now, how would you display that? Given that you know that one movie is going to look like this, how will you display it? Start writing divs in your JavaScript code, right? Give it styles and everything. Don't you think that is something which is not really your job per se? You are a JavaScript developer. You really need not know about HTML. You need to worry and concentrate about logic that is in the JavaScript. The business logic that you want to show on client side. How do I handle this click event? When do I show this pop-up? Does the style of the pop-up really matter? It does not. Does the height and width of the image matter to your logic? It does not. So we really come at a situation where we see when we look at using jQuery. So when we're using jQuery, we pretty much ended up writing a lot of code, right? You've written a lot of unnecessary code which involves creating your HTMLs inline and all that stuff. So let me just open up a text editor to show you what it would look like. Okay, the internet has gone on limited again. The internet has gone on limited again. So this is the kind of structure your jQuery will end up having, right? So you have a movie. Can everybody see the code? Right? So you'll have something called as a movie, which basically has your ID, title, summary, release date, etc., etc., etc. So this is we can call it like the class that we are creating, right? A movie class. Similarly for actors, directors, and you have an array for all movies, right? Then when you actually want to go ahead and say, I want to load all movies, you'll actually say, okay, I want to point to this particular URL, and I want to go ahead and get all these movies, and I want to pass it through a translator. So I'm not using promises as of now. I'm using, traditional jQuery only. Again, not JavaScript, just jQuery. And then I say categorize. So why do I say categorize? Because I want to say from my list of movies, every movie whose release date is after today is a coming soon movie. Every movie whose star rating is +8 is a top movie. And every movie released in the last 1 month or so is a trending movie. Right? So I need to do that categorization. So I need to call a categorize method on my movies as well. So let's look at the translators. So the translators start doing this very massive amount of logic where it just gets and starts mapping. Why do we need a translator? We need a translator because let's just say that instead of having release date in say a camel casing, the services are now sending release date in underscores, right? Release underscore date. Would you want to go across an entire application changing that? No. So it would make sense if you have a translator, right? You end up writing lesser amount of code. But you're still writing a lot of code, right? You're parsing every actor and director, etc., etc. And then you call a categorize method, and this is the show logic, right? So you actually go ahead and say, okay, fine, my coming soon movies are going to be put in a div of width 4. This is going to be the image height and width, and then the movie title. So now I am not only very, very deeply coupled to the services, but as well as with the HTML. I need to have knowledge of the classes that I'm going to use. Are we using Bootstrap? Are we not using Bootstrap? What kind of classes nomenclature are we using? Am I using double quotes or single quotes? And writing code like this can cause in a lot of errors, right? Because you're literally doing a string join. So plus, one missing apostrophe, and all of a sudden your entire code is just broken, right? So it makes us very prone to mistakes and very prone to errors, right? So this is ideally what I would say is a pure JavaScript on jQuery only. And the only one good thing that I feel that I am able to do here is that I can say I have extracted the Ajax calls out into an Ajax object. I can just say Ajax.get and Ajax.getAll and stuff like that. Right? The alternative would be me doing a $.get.JSON and iterating upon that. But extracting away all of the functionalities in one singular place means any change that I do to the core Ajax call will happen at just one place, right? I don't need to go to every call and start modifying that. But again, this is something I have done because I want to improve my code, right? So from a perspective of the amount of code that we have written an approximate of about 250 lines of JavaScript code, which is quite a lot for an application which pretty much does nothing. Right? We saw the scope of the application. It was like minuscule, but we still ended up writing a lot of code for it. What is the alternative? Multiple files. Right? You put a logic here, put some logic there, separate things out, do modularization. But that's still, you're not reducing any lines of code. Right? You're still writing as much code, only multiple different files. Right? So now, let me just take you to Ember. So we had a look at things with jQuery, and what we did realize is that it has a lot of code, right? We ended up like writing a lot of code for jQuery. So how about we use a framework, right? There is a reason God invented frameworks, because they wanted to make our development process easier, right? There's a reason we don't code in assembly language anymore, because we have languages which can do things for us which would take ages if we were doing an assembly language, right? So I'm assuming you're not familiar with Ember, right? So I'll just walk through the very basics of Ember.js as well. So Ember.js is a model view controller framework, right? You can call it a library, you can call it a framework. Ember.js's core functionality is based upon something called as routes. How many Rails people here? Anyone work on Rails? All right. So I'll come to why I asked that question. So when I say routes, I'm basically looking at the URL. So if I'm at a particular movie, I want my URL to say /movie/Dark Knight or /ID of Dark Knight. If I'm viewing the details of an actor, I want my app to say /actor/some guy, which basically means that I pick up this particular URL and I just give it to you. You should be able to just put it in your browser and you'll see the same state as I am seeing, unless it's like an authenticated thing or something like that. But for most cases, I want the state of my application to be defined by a route, right? And hence the route is the core concept. What is a view? The HTML that we spoke about. What is the model? The classes that we wrote, but that was for jQuery. And what is the controller? Something which basically controls. So in an MVC architecture, for using the view, we use a templating engine. For example, there is handlebars. So have you guys heard of handlebars? So handlebars is a templating engine to define a particular template of the view. And you can write things like, I want you to iterate over all of these objects. So you actually say each object in objects. And you can put an HTML template inside it, close the each tag, and handlebars will actually replicate that particular section for as many objects as you have, right? So you're not actually doing a for inside your JavaScript code. You're not saying for I something less than objects, do this. But that is now gone into your HTML. And you can actually bind properties from object. Let's say you took up movie. So movie.title, movie.summary, movie.actor list, movie.director, right? And you can actually put it into sections of the handlebar template and let handlebar do the rest for you. So the view, when I speak of handlebars, is basically taking away the responsibility of knowing about HTML. You are a JavaScript developer, the UI guy gives you a template, right? He says, I want one movie to look like this dude. Go ahead and do whatever you want with it. And you say, okay, fine, I got it. So let me just replace the image source with this thing. Let me just replace my title with my handlebar syntax, and that's it. You don't worry about the classes. You don't worry about writing good HTML or writing good CSS because somebody's already done that for you. You're already being more productive, right? So then we look at the model. So when we saw the model last time, we actually saw that it was written in a very brute manner, right? This, and you really were not able to understand if release date was a string, could it be an object, was it a date? What is release date? You really don't know, right? Because I had specified it as string. And that's how I would do it if I was writing jQuery, because I really don't know what you're going to give me. If you were giving me string, I would just parse it probably into a date. If you were giving me a date, I would use it as is, right? So the advantage that I get out of having a model in Ember-Data is that I can leverage Ember's two very good advantages when it comes to models. It's computed properties and observable properties, right? So computed properties are such which help you compute. For example, let's say a particular thing costs rupees 100, right? And the service gives you 100 as the value. Now you want to format it to say rs100/dash, right? So what would you do? You just go ahead and put it in your HTML just like that. But then tomorrow I come to say, no, dude, that's not going to work. I want you to replace this with the rupee symbol. Whoa, big amount of task for the UI guy, right? He's screwed. What's he going to do? So computed properties actually help you save this effort. So when I say, okay, I've got 100. So I'm going to put a property in my model, which is going to just listen to this value for 100. And whenever that value updates itself, it is just going to go and say, okay, fine. Let me take 100, put a particular symbol in front of it, put the slash and dash, and I'm done. That's it. And it's encapsulated at one place, the thing that we sort of call the class. So I'll show the Ember code in a while as well. Right? Anyways, and the second one is observable properties. So by observable properties, I mean you can actually observe other members and other controllers. So let's just say that I am somebody who is controlling a blog post. I am a post controller, right? And I want to say that I want myself to be updated whenever a comment is updated. So a post has many comments. When a comment updates, I want the entire post object to be in that state where the comment is now added to the post. How can I do that? I can only do that when I'm actually listening to the comment controller fire something like, hey, new comment added. And the moment the controller goes, new comment added, I say, okay, fine, what's your post ID? Oh, one, let me just update mine. And that's it. So I'm not only observing fields of my particular model, I can actually observe other models, other controllers. I can even observe if certain element has been added to a model array, which really gives me enough power to now build a system around this. And now let's look at the controller. So the controller is the guy responsible for everything that happens. As the name says, he is a controller. So every view has a controller. There are two types of controllers, an object controller and an array controller. And as the name suggests, an object controller can control an object, and an array controller just controls an array. So if your page has, say, a movie and a list of actors, then I'll have an object controller for the movie, which internally can have an array controller for the actors. So if I decide to add an actor, the array control will update itself. And by being an observable for the movie controller can display it accordingly. Now, it sounds extremely difficult, right? I mean, how can you just do that? It is excruciatingly painful to say, okay, fine, when you do this, I want you to do that, right? So let's have a look at the Ember code and we'll walk through that, see if it's really that difficult or not. So again, I look at the client scripts. Now notice, till now, my model has really not changed from the last time, right? When I had written for jQuery, and what I have written now is not really very different. But there is a very interesting concept that has just come up now, release year, right? So what does release year do? It says, I want you to get the value of release date, convert it into a date, and just give me the full year for that. So if the date is 5th September 2014, this will just give me 2014. But how does this get updated? So this gets updated by this particular property here. So this is a computed property listening to the release date field. Whenever the release date property of any movie changes, the release year property of that particular movie will just auto update itself without you doing anything. And that is the magic of computing properties. Right? Not very difficult till now.
Is it two-way binary?
Yes. So now what I have done in the next step is that I have something called as a person, something which I did not have last time. I have something called as a person which defines first name, last name, and I have something called as a full name again, which now binds to two properties. So if either a first name or last name changes, full name will be reevaluated. Now what is the good part here? The good part here is, if say anything but the first name and the last name changed, full name will not be recalculated at all. So a computed property will only go to reevaluate itself when any of the observables change. Otherwise, not. And then what I do here is, I just say an actor is a person and a director is a person as well. So I've used inheritance. The core concepts of Ember are also very, very close to an object-oriented programming system. So they have the concepts of inheritance, right? Which means that I can actually inherit person into actor. Not only that, I can also overwrite methods or properties for person into actor. Just the same way that you would do in Java or C#, right? One interesting thing that we saw right at the top was that this thing, a router map, which basically says, as I mentioned, the router is the most important thing for us, which says that a movie resource is bound to a path movie ID, and an actor resource is bound to a path actor ID, right? So let's just keep this in mind for the time being. Now I go down and I say, for my index route, I want you to get this particular movie. Ember by default has promises, so I can actually use a dot there, and then I can just push them into something called as an Ember array. This small Ember.a is actually converting your response array into an Ember array. What is so special about an Ember array? It's an observable array, which means that if I'm adding a movie into this array from my application, then it will auto-update anyone and anything that is listed to this particular property. So I can actually put an observable listener on index_route.model, and it will tell me that the model has been updated whenever any element of the array changes. So that's the concept of the observable array, right? And then I have an index controller. So as I said, the controller is the most important guy. Now what we see here is the controller is actually doing a very weird kind of a thing, right? We know that when you say dot property, it is listening to a particular property, right? We saw that for full name and first name. But over here it is doing an @each dot release date, right? That's kind of confusing. What do you think it does? Out of the blue, anything? Go on. Anybody? Any guesses? Each release date. Yes, but it's observable, right? So it's observable, right? So it pretty much is exactly what he said. So it is listening to each of the model's release dates. So whenever so let's say your movie array has 5 movies. So let's say the 3rd movie's release date updated. This guy will fire now, right? And this guy will now go ahead and calculate, okay, fine. Just because your release date has changed, does it mean that the trending movie section has changed? Coming soon guy says, oh, your release date has changed. Let me update myself, see if myself needs to be updated, right? So I am actually listening to a property, not every property or every object, but one property inside an array. And if the title changed, or the summary changed, or the list of actors or director changed, these guys won't fire because they don't care, right? The one thing that they care about is the release date, except for top movies who also cares about rating. So if the rating updates itself, this guy will fire anyways, right? Was it that difficult? I made it sound very difficult, but I hope it wasn't that difficult. So then I have a movie route, which is actually doing getting a route as well. And then I have certain actions and all defined. Where I say, if it's the movie, I want to add it to the watch list, etc., etc., etc. So you notice that the movie guy did not have a controller at all, right? There was a movie route and it finished. Then there's an active route and then it finished. And there's a watch list route and then it finished. So interestingly, we'll have a look at the handlebars as well. So this is what a handlebars template looks like. So when I look at this particular script, right, it's got nothing, right? It's just got text handlebars as the type, not text JavaScript. And I just go ahead and define everything in it. And I notice something called as an outlet. So has anybody worked on ASP.NET? Anybody know the concept of master pages? Right? So this is like a master page. What does it mean? This means that every page of my site will have a navigation bar. And everything that you define otherwise will be put instead of the outlet. So if your site has 5 pages, you really don't go and put the navigation bar on all 5 pages. Just define it once and you're done. And every other 5 page will just worry about its own core content. If you were creating a widget, it would also work on the same prospect, right? It will also work on the same concept. And we see an interesting tag here called as a link to tag, right? It says link to index. That's it. So link to, when handlebars compiles it, translates into an anchor tag. So it basically says, I am a link to index. A very, very readable format, right? But I've not said which page to go to, and I have really not said where you want to go. There's nothing called as index as we have seen till now. We just seen something called as index route and an index controller. But what is an index? We really don't know, right? So let's have a look at the other templates. So this template is an ID called as index, right? And then I just define, okay, fine, there is the coming soon headers. And I say for each movie in coming soon movies, okay, I want you to link to that particular movie. And movie.release here, I finish the link to and finish the each. Similar for all of the others. So trending will also have an each tag somewhere here. But these properties that we see, coming soon movies and eventually trending movies and top movies, where have we seen them before? There's one place where we have, right? In the controller. So there is a controller called as index controller. But we've not really said, this guy, listen to index controller, he's going to tell you what movies you want to have, right? And we've never told index controller to have a look at index route, to know how to get its own data and how to manage its own data, because you don't have to. So the reason I asked the question as to why, but has anybody worked on rates is because Ember works very much like Ruby on Rails. So it is a convention over configuration thing. So Ember says, if I have an index route, which is slash, I am smart enough to go ahead and pick out a template called as index. The route for that is going to be index route. The controller for that is going to be an index controller. It's none of my concern to map it, right? And all of a sudden, I have really not done a lot of work, and this particular template is listening to the properties inside index controller. And similarly for movies controller, for actors controller, and for directors controller. But we didn't have actors controller, right? So there is an obvious flaw in what I have written. Well, no, there isn't, because a controller is implicit. So when you define the model for the route, so having a look at the script, so when I've defined this guy called as actor route, the actor controller is created automatically, right? And when I write the model is an app.actor.create params.actor_id. It basically means that I want the application to create an object of type actor with the parameter actor_id, right? And I want to set up the controller by calling the local host for that particular actor_id, right? Actors/actor_id, and that's about it. Now, if I was not writing this particular line, if I didn't write all of this setup controller bit, what would happen is this model would bind to the view, right? So let's take an example. Am I going too fast? I hope not. No? Right. So over here we see that I'm binding the image source to a model.image. I'm not accessing the properties directly anymore, but I'm accessing the model itself, because I have defined the routes model to be this guy. So what happens is, what Ember does is, when we say model, Ember takes the controller and puts a model in it, something called as a model, an object. Then I say my controller has something called as coming soon movies. Okay, fine. Model coming soon movies. Then I say trending movies. Model coming soon trending movies. Right? And all of them are now accessible to the view. The view can access all of these things without really figuring out the difference between knowing whether there is a controller implemented or whether there isn't a controller implemented. And it's none of my concern anymore. Right? So, are we good till now? Does this look better than what we had done earlier? Right? We have definitely not written any more HTML in our code. Right? Using Ember alone has given us the privilege of not writing any more HTML. The UI guy gives you this. You just replace his source www.google.com with a handlebar syntax and let Ember handle the rest. Right? So looking at the app, multiple things. Oh, this is a very interesting thing that is there. So I say Ember.handlebars.register bound helper called as stars, in which I just go ahead and print a lot of stars, 5 stars, 8 stars, or something like that. Right? Now, how do I use this? Basically, I told you the concept of what I'm doing. I'm creating a div. I'm putting a small star inside it, and I'm just, oh, that's it. Yeah, that's all I'm doing for now. Right? And I'm returning the HTML for this particular div. So what will this div do? Take your rating 5, create 5 stars out of it. Take your rating 7, create 7 stars out of it. And how do we use that? So the way to use that is very simple. If I can just find that guy. Yep. That is all. So I tell handlebars, stars, movie.rating. And since it is a bound helper, if my rating were to update to 7, this guy would reevaluate itself and update itself at the same point. No code to do. Right? Are you already loving Ember? So that was a very brief introduction to Ember.js. Of course, there's like lots more to it, but we can always cover that later. So, are we good till now? Right? So keep in mind the concept of Ember.js, right? You know, routes, controllers, and views. Right? We saw the models as well. And now let's move on. Let's move on to Ember-Data. So till now, what we were doing was we created an application. Our application was our JavaScript file. Now the application would just call the service, get the data, give it to handlebars, and handlebars would handle it. Right? So it has really reduced our work till now of writing HTML, of doing a lot of parsing and etc. But we're still doing the translation bit. We still have those translators and still writing them. Now, let's understand the architecture of Ember-Data. Right? So, as I said, Ember-Data is a data persistence framework. Right? So, what does it mean? It persists data. Right? So, you have an application and you have services. Right? So, let's start. Ember-Data defines something called as a store. What's a store? Let's assume it's a book, right? It's just a lot of pages. That's what we're going to call a store, right? Now let us understand a record. A record is a page. Let's just keep it till that. We keep it plain and simple. We get into the we'll get into depth later, right? So now, when an application says, I want you to give me a movie called as The Dark Knight. The application is going to ask the store. The store says, okay, I know stuff about movies. So let me just pick out a paper which I feel is The Dark Knight movie. I'm going to give it to you. This record is The Dark Knight movie, right? So the application, instead of just calling the services directly, is now talking to a store. Somebody called as a store. So it is going to say, store, give me a movie called as Dark Knight. Here you go, this is the record movie called as Dark Knight. But the store doesn't know anything about the Dark Knight, right? We've not really asked services as to what is Dark Knight, but the store gives it anyways, right? Here you go, this is a paper which will have the details of Dark Knight. Don't show it to anybody yet, but this will have the details of Dark Knight when I let you know. Right? Now, let me introduce you the next concept. There is somebody called as an adapter. Right? So the adapter, as the name suggests, is going to do the heavy lifting of going from Ember-Data to the services. Right? And back. Right? And the next guy that we're going to look at is something called as a serializer, which basically is an envelope which has the record, right? So now what happens is, let's revisit the cycle. So the application went to the store said, here is your record, and the record said, I am the record application, you can display it to me. No data here. Now what the store does is, the store goes to the adapter, and the store says, hey, I want you to find a way to get me a movie called The Dark Knight. The adapter just goes and finds a movie, right? And now it brings this particular envelope to the serializer. And the serializer is the only one who can open the envelope. It really doesn't know anything else, right? So ideally, when the store also talks to the adapter, if it is sending a request, it would also go through the serializer. So it would just take a request, put it in an envelope, and just give it to the adapter. The adapter flies off, brings back another envelope, right? And then the serializer just unwraps it with the actual data, and the record gets updated on the view because of two-way data binding. Since the record is already bound to the application whenever any property of the record changes, the application view will change. Now what the serialize just did was, it updated the record. And since it updated the record, the application updated itself. Right? So this is Ember-Data, essentially. The core concept of Ember-Data is pretty much this. So understanding the responsibilities of everybody. What is the store doing? The store just has all of the data with itself, right? So the moment the serializer gets any data to this particular record, the store will take this record and say, now I know what darknet looks like. So the next time the application comes to the source and say, give me darknet, now the store has a prepared copy of the darknet, a cached copy, a persistent copy. And it will now give this persistent copy away to the application without having to make the call to the adapter and so on. Which basically means that Ember-Data has now started persisting everything that it is getting from the server. Right? Do you have a question? Okay, sorry. So it has actually started persisting data that you get from the application. Well, persistence is cool, yeah. You can implement caching anyways. Is there something else Ember-Data can do? So before we get into that bit, let us have a look at the code. Oops. So nothing has changed on the UI side, right? You still have your movies, your movie details, etc., etc. All of the things that were there earlier, nothing has really changed. But what has changed has the backend. So interestingly now we see that the movie is no longer extending from an Ember object, but it is extending from a DS model. What's a DS? A data store, right? So I'm saying every movie is a data store model. But now a lot of things have changed with this particular thing. I'm saying a title is a string, a summary is a string, a release date is a date, and lots of other things, right? Now, rating is a number. What is the advantage of me actually being able to specify a particular type? So Ember-Data can take a few types. It can take Boolean, number, string, date. So the advantage is that if my server is sending me a string that can be converted to a date, release date will be a date by itself. So while doing any kind of comparison, I don't have to cast release date into a type of new, putting it into new date, casting it into a JavaScript date object, and then actually doing any computation on it. That is already taken care of. When I say release date is a date. Similarly, when I say rating is a number, rating will be a number. It will not be a string. It can't be a character. It will always be a number. Now, what happens if it's not? Like the server does not give you a date back, but gives you a string which is not a date. Nothing. There will be no errors. Just release date will be empty. So you are not worrying about the format anymore. You're not worrying about your JavaScript failing, right? Of course, it's not a good thing. You should know about your JavaScript failing, but right now you just don't. Things are working fine. If somebody changed something on the service and your production code on the UI just went boom, that's still worse than knowing that, okay, I'm not showing a date. You can put some checks in out. So similarly, I've got a person, just like last time. I've got an actor, director, and I look at index route being just nothing. There is nothing in index route anymore. It just says this store find movie, right? So as I mentioned, when we looked at the diagram, The application is now asking the store to find movie. What movie? I don't know. So just get me all. That is what me saying find movie means. So we'll have a look at how can we specify what movie to get. So I say find movie, and this is going to return to me an array of movies. Right? And that is it. You don't have to worry about the translations anymore. And you do not have to worry about, you don't worry about anything anymore. That is it. Your data has been now fetched from, is now being fetched from the server. This is the part which encapsulates the behavior of calling the adapter, then calling the service, getting the response back, going through the serializer, updating a record, and displaying it on the application. Is one line. Right? Substantially less work.
You said that when you first enter the sending Android, it was not sure whether it is the one that is related.
True.
Then your adapter is going to the service and checking
True.
the
Yeah.
And at this time you are persisting it in the store, right?
Yes.
And next time there is no need of the adapter. So how are we handling the changes lately? So earlier we are seeing on change of some particular value. So how will the store get itself updated?
So the store works, the store is built on top of Ember.js itself. So when I talk of computed properties or observable properties, they are something very, very core to Ember. So the store does not violate that principle, which means that if one of my movies property changed, the thing in the cache will change as well. Right? It is not caching the server response in its JSON form. It is caching the DS model itself. It is caching an instance of the Ember object. So when something updates, the Ember object auto updates. Right? So now let's look at the index controller. So now I can just go ahead and say movie.get release date greater than new date. I'm not casting it into a date anymore. Right? I can do a direct comparison without worrying about the fact that is it a number? Is it a string? By mistake, have they sent me a character? No, it doesn't matter to me anymore. Right? And I'm already starting to write less. And then I find this particular step where I say this.store.find movie var movie.id, movie_id. And this is a call which says store, find me a movie by this particular ID. I don't write this, I find all movies. I write that part, I just get one. Am I writing any custom code for this? A get or a get all, or get it into an array, translate an array, translate one object? None needed. None required. Right? And then again the same logic of adding to watch list, etc., etc. And this time I have another interesting guy come up here. I have something called as a date field. Right? So now I want to update my view. I have an HTML5 date input type date. Right? The object that I have is a date object. So obviously that guy might not understand that. And when I update that guy, it will be text. So I want that thing to come to me as a date. My models, they understand dates. The UI element understands text. What is the correlation between the two? Well, you just write a date field. Right? You write a simple date as a function. And you say, if I have a date, then I'm going to set a value to it. If I don't, then I'm going to cast it into a type of date. Right? Means if the release date has a value, make it into a string and display it. If the value has changed, when I say property value, the value has changed. Hence, I will come here and I will just cast it into a new date. So this is a custom binding. This is something called as date binding. Right? Normally you do value binding because you're just binding values, you're binding text, or maybe you're just binding arrays. But now you're binding a freaking date. Right? And it is that simple. And given our knowledge of how stars was implemented in the handlebars, how do you think date will be implemented? We saw how stars was implemented, right? So how do you think date will be implemented? Any ideas? Yeah?
Because you have already defined as a type.
Yeah.
You cannot just do an auto bind from the side.
Of course I can.
Technically, you will have to.
Exactly. So I will just have, instead of me writing a text field, I will just call it a date field. And the entire code remains the same. Let me show it to you. Only if I can find it. Yeah. So this is how you use the custom date field that we use. So you define a view because you want to tell handlebars that I'm defining a custom inline view. So as we spoke of views, they can be as big as pages or they can be an inline view as well, like we have defined here. When I say it's date field, the type is date. So since date field is essentially a text field, I can use HTML5 date with it. And then I say the date binding is model.release date. So I'm actually doing binding not on the value, but I'm putting a small thin translation layer in between, which is just converting text into date and date into text. And now I have built a reusable component. So anywhere throughout your application, you want to use a text box which takes a date and brings it into a DS model date. And brings it into a DS model date. The process is actually that simple. Add one control, do it for you. Right? So now, going back to the presentation. When I started talking, I mentioned that we had a massive dependency on HTML when we started with jQuery. And we had a dependency on services. But now, when we saw handlebars, do you think we have managed to get rid of the dependency from HTML? Does everybody feel that way? Right? So handlebars is definitely one of the answers that we have got. Right? It's amazing. But now I'm still dependent upon my service. Right? I still need to know what services to call, what is the response of the services, which now brings me to a question. Did you guys see a URL anywhere? Any URL localhost :3000 /movie/movie item? Did you guys see a URL anywhere? No, not in the route? No, nowhere? So let's look at the routes again. I'm pretty sure there has to be a URL, right? So there is active route. Last time I remember active route definitely had a URL called as localhost 3000 /actors. Maybe looking at movie route. Nope. Movie route also seems empty. Let's look at index. Index also seems empty. There are no URLs. Obviously, there is a mistake, right? No. So remember convention over configuration. So when Ember-Data comes into picture, it actually goes ahead to say, when I'm on a route /movies, my route is a movies route, my controller is a movies controller, and if you're going to make the call will be made to a /movies. That is it. Similarly, /actors. But now the problem that I faced was that I have hosted this file locally. I've opened this file locally where my server is now running on localhost. I've never, so ideally this would just go and say file d:/workspace/ember/movies, which will result in nothing. So now how do I configure every one of these guys to just go to localhost :3000? I have 3 APIs, means at least 3 configurations, right? Not really. So Ember has a concept of an adapter that I mentioned. The adapter is responsible for going to the services and coming back. Let's look what the adapter is doing. So the REST adapter says the host is localhost 3000. And all of your URLs now will go to localhost 3000 / movies / actors / directors. It doesn't matter. But now the obvious question here is, I have my movies and actors hosted on AWS, but my directors are hosted on DigitalOcean. There is a discrepancy, right? I don't want everybody going to one place. I want you going to different places. Now I definitely need to write multiple times. Yes, you do. But every model can define its own adapter. Which means movie adapter can say, my host is not AWS, my host is DigitalOcean. What would that syntax look like? Exactly like this. But instead of reopening the REST adapter, you will just open the movie adapter. And that is it. Right? Now, similarly, let's take an example of before we get there. So the point that I was trying to make earlier. So we have actually removed our dependency from HTML, but we're still left with these services, right? So assume that you are working as a part of two teams, right? Left team and right team. So left team is responsible for creating the UI, and right team is responsible for doing the services. You're not going to start at the same point of time though. I tell you guys that, guys, we are going to build an application like IMDb. We are going to talk to these guys. They will define the services eventually, but I want you to start work. What's going to be your answer? How? Right? We don't know what service is. We don't know what they are going to send us. So one of you goes to these guys and says, please tell us, what are you going to send us? These guys are fine. We'll give you the movie, we'll have title, release date, you know, all that stuff, and just go ahead and make it. But you still don't have services. What would you do? How would you make your JavaScript logic? How would you create your UI? How would you do it? Mocks. How would you create mocks in JavaScript? Right, and then just do a find from that, pick it up, then write it, and then when the services actually come live, modify all of your code. Yeah, does that sound like something that you'd want to do? Don't you think it's a waste of time? Right? It's a massive waste of time. But now, Ember-Data really helps you with that as well. So, Ember-Data says, why don't you go ahead and define fixture data? Mocks, right? A massive amount of mock. So I say, movie fixtures is this, actors is this, etc., 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 etc. I have created the mocks. And all I say up top is that the adapter for the application is not a REST adapter, but a fixture adapter. Use mocks. And all the code remains intact. So when I say store find movie with ID 1, it will not go to the service. It will go to my array of data, find one movie whose ID is 1, bring it back to me, deploy it just like it would normally, let handlebars handle everything. Now tomorrow the services are live. You need to make a change to your application. What do you do? Right, just change the adapter. Not really, just remove the line. By default, the adapter is a REST adapter. So now, you're not really dependent upon being right. They can create whatever services they want, they can host it wherever they want, and it really does not bother you at all. Which means, now you have actually achieved complete independence from the HTML as well as from the service side. Now, it's really not a problem at all. And while the services are being built, you can actually go ahead and complete your entire application, write the entire client-side logic without any dependence whatsoever. Now, isn't that cool? Right?
not necessarily the URL, but the endpoint in terms of, okay, if I call this, it will get this stuff.
Yes, true.
So some amount of model.
Some amount of model, definitely.
So you have stuff there on.
True. But let's just say, for example, that you have an application which says, I'm going to give everything to you like in this particular syntax. But then all of a sudden, the service team decides that we are going to launch a version 2 eventually. So let's just prefix every URL with a V1, right? Now, handling a change like that when you have like 10 or 12 endpoints, unless you have a URL configuration file, is going to be multiple changes across your entire file. Whereas for Ember-Data, it is going to be one reopening of the adapter and just defining a namespace. And that's about it. Similarly, when you talk of, when you talk of anything, be it the casing of your service bus, be it the casing of your models, be it anything, in Ember-Data, the changes are usually almost always a single property change, right? You just go ahead and say the casing is an underscore casing. The namespace is v1/app. The host is AWS. And all of these processes not only happen at the application adapter level, but can also happen at host level, at a particular model level, movie level, actor level, even director level. So even if you have actors and directors hosted at a particular place and you have actually used inheritance, you can have person adapter going to a particular place and movie and directors automatically get their data from that particular place. Right? So, in a way, I feel it's a very neat feature that you can actually customize things with just one property switch. Right? You just say, do this, done, do that, done. Right? So, that was Ember-Data. Fixtures.
I have one question.
Yeah, sure.
Let's say there was a URL change in the file, right?
Yeah.
We have this and we are using fixture adapters, right?
True.
So if the URL changes, I have to change all my nodes.
So the URL is not affected by the fixtures are not affected by your mocks, right? The URL and the fixture are completely independent in a way. So when I say this.get movie, it is going to construct a URL. So this URL is to be constructed to call a service. But when I'm on fixture mode and I say this.get movie, it will just go to, okay, you just asked me to get a movie, so let me just go to the movie fixtures and find the relevant data.
So change the URL, right? So
True.
Let's say I added movie/v1/then
movie/v1/ okay. Yeah, get it, yeah.
So then I have to make a change in my fixture as well.
No, not necessarily. No, the fixtures are never expecting it. So let's just assume the store to understand where you want to get the data from. So when I say I want to get the data from a server, it is going to take all of your customization from the URL, give it to the adapter to send. But when I now say that currently I am using fixtures, so when the store tells the adapter that, hi, application adapter, do this, the application adapter says, I'm a fixture adapter, bro. I really don't need your URL. So I'll just go and find this particular ID and give it back to you. It's an array, and that's it. Pick out the element, send it along. Right? It's that simple. Good?
I would say it's not fairly like the dependency is decoupled to a large extent, but it is still dependent to some extent on the server.
True.
So decoupled to a large extent.
Yes,
right?
you'll always be dependent to a certain extent. I mean, say if name was to change to title name, then that change will have to be made throughout the application anyways. But that's something I think you really can't change. The one thing that you can do, however, is, so let's just skip through this one because I've already spoken about this. So when we look at customs basically, so the thing that we just spoke about was changes in response, right? So if you remember from the diagram, the adapter is responsible for calling the services. So any changes that happen to the URL, the adapter would handle it very, very well. But now, as the example you just mentioned, say name now changed to title, for example. What would be the one change that you can do without really affecting your entire application is you keep your model same and you extend your serializer. So your serializer gets a response which has title. It will extract this value from the response and put it into an object in the name field, right? And by sending this object, it will just take the name field and put it in the title field, right? So this is called as normalizing in Ember terms at least. So you say that you're basically normalizing the data. So you're actually defining a custom serializer. For example, an example like you just took. Let's just say that you have an X and a Y coordinate which are coming, right, from a service. But you want your app to show something which is a concrete object called as coordinate, right? But you're not actually doing a get coordinate, you're actually doing a get triangle, where a triangle has the response of the triangle being A is XY, B is XY, C is XY, not coordinate XY, coordinate XY. So what you can do is, you pick out the X and Y values, create a new coordinate object, dump it into them, and just move it along. So every guy, so your entire application still continues to work on your model just like it was earlier. The only difference now becomes that when you are unwrapping the envelope, you're just unwrapping it in a different way rather than what you were doing earlier. So the beauty of Ember-Data or Ember in general that I have found was that getting started extremely easy, right? For you to be building a simple end-to-end application, it's extremely quick. But at the same point of time, if you are someone who really wants to be hands-on or wants to experiment with Ember, it's not very difficult either, right? Because a lot of frameworks have this thing that eventually when you start doing something complicated, it gets more and more complicated. I'm not saying that's not the case with Ember-Data. That's definitely the case because I have been working on Ember-Data since version 0.13, right? And every time they launch even a remotely new version, they just change all the APIs, right? So earlier there was nothing called as a store.find or a store.save, right? They were all weird methods which you just had to do with strings. But now over time, they have actually incorporated these small things into it. And it has really made my app development experience quite better over the number of times that I've used it. Now I can dish out an application in about half an hour, right? This app that I made, half an hour tops, right? But when I sat down to write the jQuery one, it took me an hour plus. So I'm spending half the amount of time doing the same, achieving the same goal, writing pretty much half the amount of code. And I think that is definitely worth it, right? So now, once we have reached the customized bit, there is one really amazing thing that I would like to talk about. So when you have responses, right? So you think a movie response. What do you think the movie response is giving to you? It is giving you a list of movies, right? Every movie having a list of actors, like we saw, and every movie also having a director. So let me just look up an example quickly. I think this one is. Yeah, perfect. So I'm opening up here now. So remember when I said, you actually have a very specific route. You have an index.icms/movies/11, which means this is a movie ID for number 11. Which means I can take this complete URL, not this particular URL, but generally URL which looks like this, and I can give it to you on your machine. You'll open it, you'll see the same data. So the example that I wanted to show was, just strip out this guy. So there is a call that has been made. Can everybody see this? There's a call that has been made to movies, right? On localhost. I just removed the one line called as fixture, as I said. Now it is going to a server, right? Let's look at the response of movies. So the movies response basically has a very interesting syntax for actors and directors. It says actors 1, directors 1. Where 1 is especially inside an array, right? So it has just gotten certain numbers, right? Whereas I'm pretty sure that I made that I got actors to be a part of the response. I was sending all of the actors, right? All objects of the actors as a response. But movies has really got to just the values 1 and 1, right? Now let's look at what happens when I click on a particular movie. So I'm going to click on this particular movie. So I'll click on this. And we see there were 3 new calls that were made. Directors 10, actors 10, and actors 11. Right? Do we see a movie 11 call? Interestingly, I really did. Why did the movie 11 call happen? I am on movie/11. We were definitely sure that the movies route says find a movie with this particular ID. But there was not a call that was made to movies 11. Right? Exactly. The store has persisted it for you. 1 call less already. Right? So, what has actors returned to us? So the actor has just given us the details of an actor. How did it know which actor to call? Exactly. So when it got a list of movies, it says that I am bound to actor number 10 and 11 and director number 10 as well. But let me not load them now because this page does not require actors 10 and 11. The last page just had the movie image, a title, a release year. Was actors required? No. Did it load actors? No. So no unnecessary calls were fired to get data which was not needed. But now this page requires this particular data, hence definitely necessary to call for this particular actor. Lazy loading. So what did I do to implement lazy loading? Did I write anything which says lazy load true or anything like that? No, I did not. What did I do?
10 actors and not this example, but when you order to pay the order 9 items,
Yeah.
running to 50.
True.
It will make 50 calls.
It will, in an ideal case, make 50 calls. But yeah. So what happens is, right. So what happens is, just like we were passing a params.movie ID, we can actually add a property which will not send multiple calls, but it will actually send all of these calls together as a query string parameter. So it will say actors question mark ID equal to this and ID equal to this and ID equal to or something like that. And your servers then will actually have the logic of doing pagination if it wants to. So no, directly Ember cannot handle pagination. But instead of making 50 calls, you can combine all 50 calls into one, and then one big query string parameter, and then it's up to the service to be able to handle that specification.
So the first is when all the movies are loaded, right? At that point, your original service actually return the JSON with the movie and the actors as well.
Just the actor IDs in this particular case because I have optimized them. But even if they return entire actor objects, Ember would still just get the IDs.
So that's it, the service is actually giving you
An embedded response.
an embedded response with the actors
Yes.
and the movies. So would Ember split them out?
Yes, it will. Which is a bad thing. But that is where side-loaded relationships come into question. Which means that you can configure your serializer to understand this kind of a behavior. Right? So just give me 1 second and I'll show it to you. So looking at this particular model, you see that actors is a has many actor, right? And the director belongs to a type director, right? So this is how Ember knows that a movie has many actors, and for every ID that I get in the actors field, I have to call the actors API. And when I say async true, this is what enables the lazy loading. Now, when you say embedded responses, I say embedded always, and it takes embedded responses, right? But at the same point of time, what I have to make sure is the embedded always does not work solely out of the box. You need to modify the serializer. So what you do with modifying the serializer is you bring out all of the actors' properties, dump it somewhere else, and just store the IDs with that particular ID. But since you have modified it like that, the store now has track of the new actor that you have gotten as well. So it will not make a fresh call to get this actor, but it will have it in the store. But that's a change that needs to be done in the serializer, which, if I'm not wrong, they are still working on. So the objective finally being that when you write embedded always, it will auto do this stuff, but I don't think it's still live yet.
So this is like hibernate for.
Yes. Yeah, essentially that would be it. Yeah.
So what problem have you faced with this? Like on a large scale project?
Biggest problems that I faced was since Ember-Data updates so frequently, the creators are not really worried about breaking changes. Which means if I am on version beta 7 to beta 9 and I was using a particular functionality, it just was not there anymore.
No, apart from besides say version change.
Okay.
Say in managing this large data, large in the sense, how big you can scale your app with this?
Well, I have tried building a travel application with Ember-Data that worked out decently well for me. The problem that I did face, however, was when you get into too many relationships, right? When you start getting into too many relationships, saving the parent object becomes a massive headache. So how does a save work is that when I say, so let's assume this particular case on a small scale, then we can just extrapolate it, that a movie has multiple actors and a director. So to save a movie, I need to have saved all of the actors and the director first. And that becomes the job of, exactly, should be the job of Ember-Data, but it's not. They don't handle it like that, and we have to actually write code for it. So we actually say actors save and get the ID, then say actors, we save all of the actors, then we save the director, hook up all of the directors, put them into the movie and save the movie. That is one way of doing it. The other way is that you go with the embedded route, you say embedded always, modify the serializer, and then make sure that your service then is now taking an array of actor objects instead of just actor IDs. So the second way, although is better, but it's a tougher way to go because currently their entire process of normalizing the hash or writing a custom serializer is something which you really have, you really need to understand very well to be doing properly. So when I say the learning curve initially is quite easy, when you go into the serialize and adapt the customizations, then it starts becoming tough. Because then you're actually dealing with the real payload and you're stripping out objects from the payload, putting them back together and stuff like that. So that is one problem that I have always faced. As far as, well, everything else is pretty decent for now. But considering this is not still a full 1.0, so I would not suggest that you go for it or even essentially consider it for a large scale application. It's definitely something we should be aware of because a massive amount of work is going on in Ember-Data. And I feel that it will be a big thing once it launches.
What about debugging? Like, for example, we talked about a scenario where, let's say, the date is being sent, and for some reason, let's say, the date format which you're expecting is now creating a different formatted date from the server side, and
so you have an Ember debugger as well.
Okay. So you could actually step through the code and figure out.
So when you so there is this thing we have to show to you as well. Although this will not recognize my application because it is, I'm running it from a file. So, right. So this particular thing, if this was ideally working, I can think of an example. No, it's not the spelling of it. So I think discuss is built on Ember-Data, but I'm not sure. So if this was actually working, I wish I could just show it to you, but I'm not getting any ideas on the top of my head. So it can show a lot of data. Let me just give me 5 minutes. I don't know if Ember-Flare is built on top of it, but let me just open this app. Perfect. So this was another app that I had made, more booksy model. So you can actually have, you can see that there is a view tree that is defined, the application and index, and this actually tells you what template that you are using, which part of your application is the template, the model that you're using, so the index is using a record array, and the controller that you're using. Clicking on any one of these things actually gives you more data about, so what is the content, what is the store, is the data loading, is updating, whatever. This is, however, the more interesting bit. So when I click on data, it actually tells me that this is the book data. These are the 3 things that I have got. Let's say Holmes, title Sherlock Holmes. I have gotten 2 authors for this particular thing. They are ID Doyle, first name AC Doyle, etc. So you can pretty much see all of the data that you are getting from the services and how they are being rendered. So if there was a fault, you'll see it here. And it'll probably show up as an empty this thing. So you know that this particular field is the one that failed. You can actually go ahead and see what are the promises that are here. So if you just say load. So these are, it actually goes ahead and defines, gives you all the promises that were fired for loading this particular page, you can actually go ahead and have a look at every single one of them. You can inspect, you can learn actually. It's more of a learning thing than trying to debug. For me, this is where I understand how everything is internally working. And the views, the values here, I never tried that. Definitely tried. So let's say I update the book Sherlock Holmes to here. Yep, should update. Yeah. So this is pretty much persistence, right? I mean, just added, updated things here and updated there. And this is not listening to that particular handlebars section. It is actually listening to an app.book, which is an Ember object, ID Holmes. So I think that's about it from my side. Unless I have left out something. No, but yeah, that's about it. So questions? No, I have not, because I personally am of the opinion that they are very distinct and very different. Angular does not have a data persistence model as such. Ember versus Angular.
Because you can always, they have a lot of confluence.
Yes. As far as from what my experience has been, Angular definitely boasts of a much smaller code base than Ember does. Angular has, I think, about 6,000 odd lines of code. Ember is 18,000 if I'm not wrong. It's a massive file. Feature-wise, they cover similar grounds. I think they, not really. I mean, I really can't comment as such. I've not used Angular very well. Yes, knockout definitely.
This is DC.
Yes. Very massive difference.
Yeah. So, but yeah, apart from the
yeah. So for
development wise, I want to know.
So from what I've seen is that maintaining observable arrays and updating elements inside observable arrays in Knockout.js is a hassle. So I really have to listen to every element of the array itself, and I really can't listen to a property of an element inside the array, which Ember does really allow me to do using this. Having a controller allows me to really separate out the things which are my model to things which are specific to my controller.
You can do in that as well.
You can do that in Knockout, but say when you get that, you will probably have something called as movies in your Knockout model and everything else. But over here, the concept of having a model versus having properties inside the controller are very distinct and very different. When I say I want to add something to watch list, that is a job of a controller and it has nothing to do with the model itself. So it is separation of concern from my perspective. Using something like Knockout, everything is then dumped into the view model. The view model has your properties which affect your view. It has properties which talk to the business directly, and that is like one gigantic place where all the changes are made. From my
the controller.
not necessarily. Like we saw, there were two routes which didn't specify a controller at all. So over here, the route is more important. So any kind of an action that you specify is ideally specified on the route rather than on top of the controller, unless it needs to be with the controller, right? Secondly, the way things are invoked between the view and the controller are also very different. So when I've not yet defined a view here, but I can actually go ahead and define something .app.post view, and the post view can have things related to just the view, right? Some certain properties like show background color to be green or clicking on a button show background color to be red. Now, ideally, clicking on a button handled by the controller, background color change handled by this particular the view, right? So yes, no should change the color of the background. So the view does not know what is yes and what is no. The controller doesn't know what is red and what is green. So what the controller can really do is the controller then invokes the view, but not in a direct fashion. the view has to register this method with the controller. So the register says that if you want to invoke me, this is how you want to. This is how you can invoke me. And then the controller, upon the clicking, will just send this command. It will not invoke an instance of the view with the. It will not invoke a method of the view with an instance of the view, but it will just say this dot find view dot send a particular method name, and that method name will then be captured by the view and handled how the view wants. So exactly, very unlike Knockout. Knockout doesn't have a view. You just have a view model. You have a view template, yes, but I'm saying that you can actually write code for the view, very specific to the view, just like we had mentioned the date field, but that's not a pure view. A pure view would be where I can define the entire movie view and certain properties related to it inside my JavaScript itself. And the view then can listen to all three. It can listen to your controller, the model, and it can listen to things in the view as well. It's very helpful when you're creating partial views. So let's say you have a list of flights that come up, and so your controller is an array controller, and your view is basically a tuple. But now you want to say that I want each one of my flights to have a particular controller. So you can actually have a partial view set up here, which will just work inside that each, and every partial view will now get a controller instance of its own. True, it's like a separate template. It is a separate template, but without any changes to the URL or the state of anything.
And the mask is an independent framework.
Absolutely.
You can use it anywhere.
Absolutely.
People are getting a lot of traction.
Definitely. Here is something like the URL is not the handlebars this thing. The routing is not handlebars again. It is something called as pseudo routes or something like that. The hash slash. Yeah, it's called something else. It's a JavaScript thing.
It's that functionality offered by Ember.
I don't think so. No.
But
Templating.
let's template.
But the problem that we face with handlebars is it can't have any logic. So unlike JTemplate, where you can just go and write a bunch of things inside the template itself, handlebars can just understand things like each, if, etc., etc. And for everything else that you write, you have to go ahead and create a method yourself. So Ember really goes ahead to extend handlebars helpers to create something called as those bound helpers, which basically work like an observable property, but they're actually updating the view.
That's some bit of integration.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.